We're pleased to be joined by sociology PhD and assistant professor of sociology at USC and author of upcoming book Carceral Apartheid, Brittany Friedman. I do want to start the interview by saying thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Brandon. I have been very much looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, and the pleasure is all ours. So, one of the central and most powerful themes of your book, obviously, with the name being carceral apartheid, is kind of the power dynamic with racial intent that results in what you would call carceral apartheid. So, could you start by just explaining for us what this means to you and what it looks like to the victims of it?
Yes, absolutely. So as you pointed out, I start my book with really centering racist intent. And the reason I start carceral apartheid in that way is because actually in, academia, it is a lot of the focus is on, collateral consequences or like ways that structure, if you will, like societal institutions create, bad things, whether or not they're trying to. And a lot of my work, because I'm focusing on cover ups, is like, actually, no, they meant to do it. Like they tried to do it, they planned, they organized themselves. And, before computers, they're doing this in letters and memos, which is what I show. So I was able to actually uncover that there was this racist intent to divide incarcerated people on the basis of race and ethnicity, meaning divide them by, white, black, whether you identify as Latino or not, and then use that as a weapon to create battles between racial groups. And all of this occurred because the Department of Corrections was really following the cue of the FBI and COINTELPRO. And they're like, okay, the best way to like declare war on a population and to divide them on the basis of race is to, use these formal policies such as, assigning people based on race, such as housing them. And it wasn't good enough. They realized, wait, we actually need an informal policy or what I describe as extra legal policies. And that also follows the cue of law enforcement on the outside. It's like, okay, so we're going to set them up to die in gladiator fights. We're going to spread rumors, to the Aryan Brotherhood. Hey, look, people who are aligned with the civil rights movement, they're trying to kill you. Those types of extra legal strategies combined with these official narratives of like segregation, those are forming the basis of what I'm terming as carceral apartheid and really showing that, this is really one case of this. This is all happening historically in similar eras. So we should think of carceral apartheid in the US as a global phenomenon.
And this is something that is used rather strategically at times. I think one example of this that you raised was in California prisons in the 50s, targeting Black people and Black militants. Could you kind of shed some light on this, how it was carried out and the effects that it might have had?
So the California Department of Corrections in Sacramento is where the prison officials are housed with politicians. They're very scared, similar to our officials in Washington. They're very scared of what they see happening on the outside, right? They see the marches for civil rights. They see the backlash. They see the clashes with the Klan on the outside. And so they're like, we don't want this to happen in our prison system. So they very preemptively, before anything started, popping off in California, in the prisons, they preemptively start to design a system of identifying Black people that they suspected could be sympathetic to the civil rights movement or were involved in organizations related to it. And they start to identify people. Next, they start to segregate them into adjustment centers, which are pretty much solitary isolation cells, very much like think Black Mirror. Like it's called adjustment because they're trying to psychologically and socially readjust their mind. And it's because of their political beliefs. And so that really starts this saga in California of this discriminatory practice of just targeting and disappearing people into these cells. And, my book really shows this process in the first half. And then the second half, I show, how did people fight back? How they organize themselves against this?
So yeah, and I am really curious, what are some of these techniques, kind of like the ones you just spoke to, that prisons indulge in to remain in power, keep the power imbalance, the domination, really, whether legal or, as you mentioned, extra legal, in how they would carry them out.
So, one example I can give is, in the book, I described someone who I give a pseudonym to as Anthony. And Anthony's story is especially emblematic of this because, he comes into the California prison system in the 60s. He's very young. So he's coming out of the youth authority and then going into the adult max system. And he's a part of groups on the outside, so he's like the ideal in terms of who and what they're targeting. He comes in, he's peacefully getting acquainted in the system, and he very quickly becomes identified as a potential Black militant and surveilled. Anthony survives a lot in terms of official policies, right? He's surviving these segregation tactics. He's surviving solitary. But then on the extra legal side, which is really how the system is staying in power, because, solitary is not enough. That's actually, believe it or not, it's not enough to squash a movement. For the department, what's enough is, okay, well, we're actually going to partner with incarcerated white supremacists who have the same political goals as us, right? Like, they don't want a civil rights movement in California prisons. They don't want to be anywhere near incarcerated Black people. And I'm talking about people who are self-described Nazis at the time, people who are members of different biker organizations on the outside that are explicitly white supremacist. So they band themselves together. That forms the basis of what becomes the Aryan Brotherhood. So my book is Carceral Apartheid's telling that history too, and how the department sees them as allies and, really provides them with a lot of cover and political and social protection that, someone like Anthony, that's also what he's surviving. He's surviving an organized white supremacist movement that's backed by law enforcement. And so for many people, when I say that, they're like, oh, we can see that happening now in society. And I'm like, yeah, my book, if you want to know the history of how this repeats itself over and over as a strategy of control, read my book, because I'm showing you that it's not a new strategy. This is a long-term strategy.
Yeah, I'm excited that that's where you went. That was actually my next question, was going to be kind of about the allyship that you spoke to between like the white inmates, the white supremacists, and the guards, and how they use that to perpetuate racism. And could you kind of how did this come to be? Was this from the start, or was it more of a response maybe to, I don't know, backlash from the racist structures, or, where did it begin to see this form?
So the evidence that I was able to compile shows that it was, it's always been like an unspoken alliance, like that we're all white. But that's because we're living, in at the time, right? They're living in the United States as we are, which is a polarizing, Black, white, right, binary. So that exists because people come into prison with their identities. So just because you're an officer or an inmate, like, you don't forget you're white, just like you don't forget you're Black. So that exists as a baseline. But what I am showing that I found so interesting is that when you start to see increases in the number of Black people that are becoming incarcerated, and it starts to exponentially spike what we term mass incarceration. So it's like in the 50s and 60s, the numbers are already rising before the war on crime, war on drugs. And incarcerated white people are noticing this because next to them, right, the number of Black people is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And they're like, this is not good for us, because numbers matter. And so then officers notice it and they're like, this isn't good for us either. So it becomes this sort of like political dynamic where you think of that phrase of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so it's like, even though we're not necessarily on the same side, because you're an officer and I'm an inmate, we are on the same side right now. And we see the same thing happening, if you will, on the outside, where it's like, I might be in this group and you're police, but if we have a common enemy that we need to defeat, there can be these momentary alliances, if you will, because they actually saw themselves as being at war, as in a race war, within a confined space, which is even scarier than if you're just like on the outside in a normal battlefield.
There's not as many places to run or hide from it. It's a lot more head-on confrontation. One of the things I always have to ask when talking about more racially fueled topics, as I've learned, if I don't, the first pushback I get in the comments is, oh, it doesn't happen anymore, or whatever it may be. Can you detail the ways that this is still happening today? Has it changed the way it looks? Could you kind of go into how this is still an issue?
Absolutely. So within prisons today, this is still happening. So I at the end of my book, and I actually start the book with the present, end with the present. So I start in the present with the murder of Hugo Pinnell in 2015. So Hugo Pinnell, for those who don't know, he's a co-founder of the Black Guerrilla Family, and the Black Guerrilla Family emerges to really fight against this system of war and domination that I'm describing. So he gets murdered by the Aryan Brotherhood in very suspicious circumstances. So much so that his family files a wrongful death suit with the Department of Corrections because there's suspicion in terms of like, why was he released in the way that he was, so that he was an easy target by the Aryan Brotherhood. So he dies in 2015. That's one example of a potential setup, or I would call it an alleged setup. Another example is in contemporary times, we have, notorious gladiator fights that still happen in California, where officers are setting up people of different racial groups to keep the divisions alive. And especially since there was a historic moment in California where all of these different groups and factions signed a document called the Agreement to End Hostilities, which I talk about at the end of the book, actually explicitly saying, like, we know what the officers are doing. We know the department wants us to fight each other, and we're just going to like lay down our arms. We quit. We're not doing it anymore. So this this death of Hugo in the wake of that, the continuance of the gladiator fights, it's the officers' effort to continue this, decades long battle that they started for their own gain. And so why try new tricks, if you will? Like this is a tried and true system of control. And then on the outside, similarly, we have a long-standing history in the United States, especially of law enforcement colluding with white supremacist groups, from the Klan to now the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. Like these collusions happen to win. It's politically viable and it's proven to work.
One question I was really interested to ask you, because people who watch my channel, my show or whatever, know that I like sociology as well. I like looking at like sociological aspects of things. How do you think that these systems of apartheid that we see in the prison system reflect maybe what happens on the outside, still in like American society, or even crimes and things we might perpetuate abroad, whether it be like genocide or torture in other countries and stuff?
Well, particularly in the United States, on the outside, we do still see these alliances between law enforcement and civilians as a means of maintaining racial boundaries and binaries. And that's because, as human beings, if we were to realize that we all hold the sanctity of life and that we're all the same, that's a very powerful force against this structure. It's about a very powerful force against the state to unite ourselves. And that's arguably what got, some of the main people I describe in my book, and I share their story. One of the main reasons that they were targeted and murdered, I argue, and many others have argued, it's not just that they were pointing out the system, it's that they were trying to unite everybody. One of the main murders I talk about in the book of W.L. Nolan, he was murdered after circulating a petition to try to unite incarcerated people across race against the Department of Corrections. And then he was murdered by the Aryan Brotherhood. So it's like There's this unity is scary. And I think we see the same thing happening now with what's happening specifically in the African continent, and what's happening in the Middle East and what's happening in the Gaza Strip. So specifically, right, we know from research ongoing from the UN, from human rights groups, that the United States is very active, not just in funding the genocide that we see in Gaza, but also very active in the training of soldiers. And there's this reciprocal relationship of training that happens between the IDF and between police forces and military as well in the United States. And so these are concrete connections, and the list is very long. And we see the exact same concrete connections when we're looking at corrections in the US, but also on the outside. And so this tells you sociologically that this is a pattern. We can't talk about carceral apartheid as an isolated system. We have to think about it more as an ethos. It's a way of being. It's a way that governments move and plot here in the US, and a way that they create alliances with other governments that are moving similarly, because they have shared goals. And so that's how I think about it. That's how I teach when I'm talking about the power of sociological theory. It's because it allows you to see connections so that you're no longer thinking of the world as like isolated incidents.
Yeah, it really is a pattern or cycle that you often see with like forces of liberation versus those in control or already in power trying to stop that. And it's just something that reflects to our prison systems. I do have two more questions that I want to ask you. One is one that I like to ask anyone who's done extensive research on a topic. Were there any findings through your research that you thought were rather surprising, either to genuinely surprising to you, or that you just might think would be surprising to someone who's not as well read on the topic?
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that's a brilliant question. I'm like thinking about it. I'm like, oh wait, because there were so many epiphanies that I had. I think for me, I had the biggest aha moments when I was doing life history interviews with people who served several decades in California prisons. And something that they would say in the interview was almost just like identical to something I found in the archive. Like something I could have, like someone could be talking about something that happened to them in the 80s or 90s, but like in the archive, I found something where someone's giving an interview for a prison incident report, and they're describing a very similar experience in the 60s. And it just kind of gives you the chills, because you're like, oh my gosh, they've been doing this for a very long time. And I had several of those moments in the middle of my face-to-face interviews, and I'm just like trying to keep my face together, but I'm just like, oh my god, like
Yeah.
it's like I after the interview, we're trained to take notes after the interviews. So like any of your aha moments, you don't forget them. And I'm just writing because I'm having all of these epiphanies where it's like a puzzle. Like I said, that's how I think about my work. I set out with just kind of like, I have an idea of my questions, but I really am trying to learn along the way, and I want to be surprised. So I allow myself to be open in that way. And when I have the surprises, they are just like, it's so rewarding, but it's an indescribable feeling when you put like a puzzle piece together. People who do puzzles understand what I'm talking about.
Totally. I think we would make a lot more progress as a society if more people had that view and willingness to learn, and maybe saw learning as a puzzle. I don't know. It might be some insight in there to take. So I think we've spent a lot of time looking back in the past. We spoke about how it's still happening today. I like to end looking forward in my interviews where we can. What do you think needs to change, maybe from what you've learned through what's wrong, in terms of pulling from this power imbalance that exists in the prison, the racial sentiments, and these techniques that we spoke of that's carried out and essentially to carry out a carceral apartheid?
One of the biggest things that I want to see happen from this book really resides in the mission of the conclusion. So the conclusion in Carceral Apartheid is called Invitation to Awaken. And I called it that because I want people by the end of this book to think about in their own lives, like where are there lies in your life that are fed to you by school, by religion, by media, politicians, and how are these lies shaping your behavior in a way that's actually not true to you? Because I think that that's fundamentally why these systems of domination and control exist. Because if you think about it, first and foremost, the idea of race is a lie, white supremacy is a lie, but they are incredibly powerful lies that have an energy and they remain a constant because they serve a function, not just for control, but it's like, what do you gain from the control? You gain resources, right? Money, power, ultimately. And so I really want people to think about, where are there places in your life where your power is being siphoned because you are actively still believing the lies that you're fed. And I think that that is a way of like fundamentally reorganizing how you see the world, how you see your place in the world, and what your role is in our collective liberation. And what is your part? Like, is your part uncovering things that are hidden and writing a book about it? Is your part organizing mutual aid? Are you supposed to be out, educating people in some other way? Or are you supposed to be supporting the liberation of your family and, old beliefs they might be carrying that are harmful? It's like there's so many ways that we can play a role that is very meaningful, and like no one's role is small. Everyone's role is big, right? And so that's what I want people to realize. It's like you can do something. You're not powerless. That's also a lie.
Yeah, I that's very wonderfully put, honestly. Yeah, so I want to give you a chance. I'm going to have your website linked in the description. If you want to tell people when the book's coming out, where to get it, shout out the title one more time, where to follow you, all of those things, the floor is yours.
So you all can find me at brittanyfriedman.com. My book, Carceral Apartheid, How Lies and White Supremacists Run Our Prisons, will be out on Tuesday, which is January 7th. I can't believe even saying that, I'm like, it's Tuesday, it's coming up. So if you're in the DC area, you can actually find me on Tuesday at Politics and Prose in DC, giving a talk about my book on Pub Day. On my website, you can find info about my tour. And if I'm going to be in your city, I'd love to see you. And you can find me on social media at Curly Professor. I love Instagram, so that's my favorite one, but you can find me on all the sites at Curly Professor, Blue Sky, the same. And I have a new Substack. So I'm excited about this. The Substack's launching next week. It's a special place for me to just, say whatever I want, basically. And it's called Truth Teller Speaks. So I hope to see you over there as well.
Yes. And again, I will have the link to her website in the description. Anyone that wants to follow up on any of that. I will say we are twin new Substack authors. I also started one for the new year. So
Yay!
That's exciting stuff. But yeah, good luck with your book publication date and release. I hope it all goes amazing. You definitely deserve it. You're really knowledgeable on what you're talking about. And I just thank you again for sharing some of that with us for a little.
Thanks, Brandon. This was fun, and I'm happy to be here. And again, I really like that poster. I don't know what that is, and the one right in the back,
that
the
one?
box. Yes,
Yeah.
it's fine.
Thank you. It's Roy Jones Jr., anyone, classic boxer. Yeah. Yeah, we'd love to have you back on, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.